The morning Samuel Barker found the dead boar on his doorstep. He thought something had gone terribly wrong with his life out on the frontier, and he had no idea yet how magnificently right it was about to become. He stood in the gray, frost-bitten light of early autumn, one boot still unlaced, a tin cup of chicory brew steaming in his hand, and stared at the creature laid across his threshold with the kind of careful, deliberate placement that left no doubt it had been put there on purpose. It was massive, a full-grown hill boar with tusks like curved bone daggers and a hide bristled with coarse black hair, and it had been killed not with a blade or a bolt, but with bare hands. He could tell because there were no puncture wounds from any weapon he recognized, only the evidence of tremendous, precise force applied to the neck and skull, bruising so deep it had purpled through the thick hide itself. Samuel set down his cup on the porch railing and crouched beside the animal, running calloused fingers along its flank. He was a baker by training and a frontier homesteader by necessity, 26 years old and 3 seasons into carving a life from the eastern edge of the Duskwood territory, where the human settlements thinned out and the old wild lands began again. He had come here after the bakery in Cresthelloe burned, after his father's debts ate the ruins, after there was nothing left in the settled towns for a man with strong arms, a modest inheritance of seed and tools, and a stubborn refusal to break. He had built the cabin himself. He baked bread in a clay oven he had fired and shaped over the course of a week. He kept a small garden of winter root vegetables and an herb bed that he tended with the same patient attention he had once given to dough. He was not a warrior. He was not particularly imposing. He was lean and brown-haired and sun-darkened, with hands that bore the twin calluses of the baker and the axeman, and green eyes that his mother had once called the color of a field after rain. He was, by most accounts, entirely ordinary and entirely alone out here, in the way that the frontier demanded but never made easy. He looked at the boar again. He looked at the tree line. The eastern Duskwood began no more than 40 yards from his cabin, a dark wall of old-growth pine and black-barked elder oak, and somewhere inside that darkness, something had watched him find this gift. He had no other word for it, because that was clearly what it was. He straightened up, shading his eyes against the low autumn sun, and waited. Nothing moved in the tree line. Samuel Barker picked up the boar by its hind legs, grunting with the effort, because it was a genuinely enormous animal, and dragged it around to the side of the cabin where his butchering post stood. He had work to do, even if he did not yet understand what it meant. He had seen orcs before, of course. Everyone in the eastern settlements had. The Stoneclan territories bordered the Duskwood's deeper reaches, and there were orcs who traded occasionally at the market in Fernville, the nearest proper town, 2 days' ride west. They were a tall people, broad through the shoulder, with green-gray skin that ranged from the pale sage of the Highland clans to the deep forest green of the lowland ones, and tusks, not the exaggerated monster horns of the old stories, but modest, elegant protrusions of ivory that curved up from the lower jaw. Most humans in the eastern settlements kept a cautious distance. Not out of active hatred, that was more a city sentiment, the kind bred by distance and rumor, but out of the simple, humble nervousness of people who did not know the customs and did not want to give offense, or get hurt. Samuel had exchanged nods with orc traders at the Fernville market. He had once handed a cup of water to an orc woman who had been walking the road in the summer heat, a gesture he had not thought twice about, which had apparently startled her so much she had stood in place for a full 5 seconds before accepting it. He had traded a loaf of his bread, still warm from the stone, for a small keg of Stoneclan fermented berry wine that he had been quietly rationing ever since because it was extraordinary. He knew almost nothing of their customs. He should have known more. He would come to understand that later. He was halfway through butchering the boar. It was good, clean meat, better than anything he could have hunted himself when he heard the sound. Not loud, just the press of a heavy footstep on the dry pine needles at the edge of the tree line, deliberate enough to be heard, which meant it was deliberate. Something large enough and skilled enough to move in total silence through old-growth forest had chosen to make a sound. That was a message. Samuel set down his skinning knife, wiped his hands on his leather apron, and turned around. She stood at the edge of the trees, and she was the most singular person he had ever seen. Yatul Stonefist was 24 years old, which he would not learn for some time, and she stood at nearly 6.5 feet, broad through the shoulder in the way of her people, with arms that the current evidence suggested were capable of killing large wild animals without tools. Her skin was a deep, warm forest green, like pine needles in shadow, and her hair was black and thick, braided back from her face in a complex arrangement held with small carved bone rings. Her tusks were neat and white, curving up just past the line of her lower lip, and her eyes were amber, a bright, clear, startling amber that caught the morning light like a hawk's. She wore frontier leathers, practical and worn, a long vest of dark hide over a heavy linen shirt, trousers tucked into knee-high boots that had seen serious use, a hunting knife at her hip that she had apparently not used this morning, a jaw set hard in the particular way of someone waiting to be treated badly. She was watching him with those amber eyes, waiting. Samuel Barker looked at the half-butchered boar. He looked at her. He looked at the bruising on the boar's neck that matched approximately the size of her hands. "You killed this," he said. It was not a question. Her chin lifted slightly. "Yes." Her voice was lower than his, a deep, resonant contralto, and she spoke the common tongue without an accent, which surprised him. He did not know then that she had been trading at Fernville since she was 16 and had spent more time among human settlements than most of her clan approved of. "Why?" Samuel asked. It was, he would later understand, precisely the wrong question, not wrong in the offensive sense, but wrong in the sense of a man who does not yet speak the language trying to say something kind and landing on something baffling. He did not know what the gift meant. He only knew it was clearly a gift, and that the woman who had given it was watching him with something complicated in her face that he could not yet read. Yatul's jaw tightened. "I have been hunting the eastern ridge for 2 seasons, she said. "You built your cabin on the edge of my territory. I have watched you." She paused. "You are respectful. You do not cut more trees than you need. You do not leave waste. You put out water for the forest animals in summer." Another pause, and something in her expression shifted, became harder to read. "The boar was destroying your garden. I killed it." Samuel looked at the torn-up edge of his root garden, which he had been cursing for 3 days without identifying the culprit. Then he looked back at her. "You could have told me," he said. "Or I could have." "I am telling you now," she said, and there was something careful in her voice, something that was neither aggressive nor soft but waiting, the way a person waits when they have done something brave and do not yet know if it was worth it. Samuel Barker was not a complicated man in the ways that mattered most. He was not the kind of man who looked at an enormous gift dropped on his doorstep by a woman who had been quietly watching over his farm, watching over him, and thought to find reasons for suspicion. He was the kind of man who recognized generosity when it showed up, even when it arrived in an unconventional form. "Well," he said, "that's a lot of boar. I'll be salting meat for a month." He looked at her. "You should have some. That's only fair." Yatul stared at him. Not the stare of someone offended, but the stare of someone who had expected a very different conversation and had been entirely wrong about how it would go. "You are inviting me to share the meat," she said slowly, as if she needed to be sure she had understood correctly. "You did the hard part," Samuel said reasonably. He pulled off his leather apron and offered her a nod in the direction of the cabin. "I have bread, and I have that berry wine I got at Fernville Market 3 months ago. It's yours if you want to come in out of the cold." She did not come in that day. She stood at the edge of the trees for another long moment, watching him with those bright amber eyes, and then she said, quietly, "I will come back tomorrow," and disappeared into the forest with a silence so complete it was almost theatrical. Samuel Barker finished butchering the boar, set aside a generous portion on a clean cloth at the edge of the tree line, and went inside to start his bread. She came back in the evening. Not the next morning, as she had said, but that evening, when the light was going copper and he was sitting on his porch watching it happen, which was a thing he did when the day's work was done, and the loneliness got too big to keep inside the cabin. He heard her before he saw her, that same deliberate half-announcement of footsteps, and then she stepped out of the trees and walked toward him with the portion of boar meat he had left on the cloth, now wrapped in a piece of cured hide. She had cooked it over a campfire. He could smell the smoke on it, and she set it on the porch railing beside his cup. "You left more than I could use," she said. "I brought it back prepared." Samuel looked at the wrapped meat. It smelled extraordinary. She had used herbs he could not immediately name, something piney and something sweet. "Thank you," he said. "Sit down if you want." She looked at the second chair on his porch. He kept two, because hope was the kind of habit he hadn't been able to break, and after a moment she sat in it. Not comfortably, with the careful, upright attention of someone who was not yet sure this was safe but had decided to try it anyway. They sat in silence for a while, watching the light die over the tree line and the first cold stars arrive. Samuel ate the boar. It was the best thing he had eaten since he had come to the frontier, which was something he said aloud without thinking. Yatul said nothing, but something eased in her face. "I am Yatul Stonefist," she said after a while. "Samuel Barker," he said. "I know," she said. "The Fernville market people call you the bread man of the Duskwood road." Samuel laughed, a short, surprised sound. "That's less impressive than it sounds." "It is more impressive than you think," she said. "You have survived 3 winters here alone. Most men who try this do not last 2. He looked at her sideways. "You've been keeping track." She did not answer directly. She looked at the darkening forest, and her profile was clean and sharp against the sky, the curve of her tusks catching the last of the light. "The Duskwood frontier is Stoneclan territory," she said. "We keep track of what happens in it. You are the only human settler on the eastern edge who has not given us reason for trouble." "What kind of trouble do the others give?" "The usual kind," she said, with a flatness that told him there were stories there she did not intend to tell tonight. "They cut too much. They drive away game. They leave their waste in the water. Some of them trap on the clan paths without knowing or caring." She looked at him. "You did not do these things." "I didn't know about the clan paths," he admitted, "but I figured there were people in this forest before I came to it." "Most humans do not figure that," she said. "Most humans haven't thought about it much," he said. "I have been alone out here a long time. You think about things when you're alone." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, you do." He looked at her then, and she was already looking at him. And there was something in the amber of her eyes that was still guarded but no longer entirely closed off. The way a door is when it is latched but not locked. They did not have a long conversation that night. She left when the cold set in properly, declining his offer of the fire inside, and walked back into the forest. But she left the cured hide cloth on his porch railing, folded neatly. He kept it. He wasn't sure why, only that it felt like something worth keeping. She came back 3 days later, then 4 days after that, then 2 days after that. The intervals shortened without announcement, which was its own kind of conversation. She always came in the early evening, and she always sat in the second chair, and they talked slowly at first, carefully, the way 2 people talk when they are feeling for solid ground and aware that the drop on either side is steep. He learned. She was the 3rd daughter of clan elder Yatul Stonefist, which made her the daughter of a chief in everything but the name her people used for it. She had 4 brothers, 2 sisters, and a complicated relationship with the expectation that she would make a politically useful match within the Stoneclan, a pressure she described with the blunt economy of someone who had been resisting it for years. She had learned the common tongue from a human scholar who had lived 1 season near the clan territory 20 years ago, and she had extended and refined it through years of trade at Fernville, and she read. This surprised him enormously. She had a collection of human books traded and bartered over years, kept in a waxed hide satchel at her camp. She was a hunter first and before everything, a tracker of extraordinary skill, the best in the Stoneclan by reputation, and she had killed the boar with her bare hands because that was the traditional Stoneclan method of the first hunt gift. And she had not. She told him this with a perfectly level expression that betrayed absolutely nothing, realized that he would not know what that meant. He learned that last piece about 6 weeks after the first boar morning. Sitting beside the fire he had finally convinced her to come inside for, and when she told him what the hunt gift meant in her culture, she was watching the fire, not him. In Stoneclan, she said carefully, as if she had rehearsed this and was discovering that rehearsal was insufficient. When a woman wishes to declare intent to a man she finds worthy, she brings him a hunt gift. Killed barehanded because it shows strength. Placed at his threshold because it is an offering of the self. The man may accept it and give hospitality in return, which is acknowledgement, or he may leave it untouched, which is refusal. She was quiet for a moment. You accepted it immediately and invited me to share the meal. In our custom, that is. She stopped. Her jaw was tight. That is a response of strong approval. Samuel Barker sat very still for a moment, staring at the fire. He thought about this. About the 6 weeks of evenings, the slow unwinding of caution, the second chair he had kept for years for no reason he had ever properly explained to himself. He thought about the way he waited now for the sound of her footsteps on the pine needles. The way the evenings without her had begun to feel wrong, like a meal missing its main course, like bread without salt. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you did not know," she said. She was still watching the fire. Her hands, large and capable and scared of nothing, were folded in her lap with a deliberateness that told him they were not entirely steady. I knew you would not understand the custom. I should have explained it before, but I did not because," she stopped again. "Because," he said softly. She turned her head and looked at him, and the amber of her eyes in the firelight was extraordinary, deep and warm and raw with something she was not used to showing. "Because I was afraid," she said, "that if I explained it first, you would be kind about it and tell me you did not mean it that way, and I would have had to leave and not come back. And I did not want to leave." Samuel Barker was quiet for a long moment. Outside the cabin, the autumn wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. The fire cracked and settled. "I am glad you didn't leave," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You are not troubled by it, what it means." "I am troubled by the fact that I've been accidentally courting you according to your customs for 6 weeks without knowing it," he said, "and I am going to need some time to work out exactly how to feel about the specifics of the thing. But I am not troubled by you, Yatul. I have not been troubled by you from the first morning. You left a dead boar on my doorstep, and I thought it was the most interesting thing that had ever happened to me." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile but something that was going to become one. "It was a very good boar," she said. "Exceptional boar," he agreed. And then they both laughed, real and full, and the sound of it filled the cabin and went out through the chinks in the log walls into the cold autumn night, and something that had been building between them since the first morning found its first solid footing. She still did not stay the night. She left as the deep cold set in, pulling on her outer vest, and paused in the doorway with one hand on the frame, the firelight behind her and the forest dark ahead. "I will come back tomorrow," she said. This time it was not a hedge or a delay. It was a promise. "I'll have bread ready," he said. She looked at him with those amber eyes for a moment, and then she walked into the forest, and Samuel Barker sat by his fire for a long time, feeling the particular warm, complicated, slightly terrifying feeling of a man who has just realized that something real is beginning. Winter came to the Duskwood frontier with its usual lack of ceremony. One morning the frost did not leave by midday, and by the week's end the first proper snow was coming down through the trees in slow, heavy curtains. Samuel banked his fires, sealed the window gaps with clay and packed straw, and settled into the winter routine of cabin work, mending tools, drying herbs, baking in the clay oven for the stores that would carry him through the deep cold months. Yatul came every other day, sometimes every day. The walks from her camp were longer now, the snow making the forest floor slow going even for someone of her skill, but she made them without complaint. She did not always stay long. Sometimes she brought things, a brace of winter hair, a bundle of dried mushrooms, once a small carved wooden figure that she set on his table without explanation and left before he could ask about it. It was a figure of a woman in a hunter's crouch, details precise in the wood, and he put it on the shelf above his hearth where it stayed for the rest of his life. He began, carefully, to learn Stoneclan customs, not because he was asked to, but because he realized that he had been operating in profound ignorance of the life she moved through, and he found that he minded that. He minded not understanding things about her. He asked questions, clumsily at first, trying to avoid the particular kind of clumsy that came from treating another person's culture as a curiosity rather than a reality. And Yatul answered with the careful patience of someone who was not used to being asked in good faith and was adjusting to it. He learned that the Stoneclan were matrilineal in property and lineage, patrilineal in clan leadership, and that this created a permanent, productive tension in their governance that accounted for a great deal of their political complexity. He learned that hunt gifts were given between any genders and in any direction, that they were the most formal declaration of romantic intent in Stoneclan tradition, and that the bare-handed requirement was not universal. It was a higher honor, reserved for declarations of exceptional depth. He absorbed this last piece of information, and then sat with it for 2 days before telling her he had understood it. So killing the boar bare-handed, he said, on a winter evening when they were sitting side by side at his table with a pot of root stew between them, that wasn't just the custom. That was the full declaration, she said. Yes. You were very sure about me, he said, not quite keeping the warmth out of his voice. Her expression did something complicated. I was not sure, she said. I was decided. Those are different things. She looked at the table. Being decided means you have chosen, even without the certainty of the outcome. I had watched you for 2 seasons, Samuel. I knew what kind of man you were. I did not know what you would do with that information, but I knew I would rather know than not know. And if I had left the boar untouched, he said, then I would have left and not come back, she said, and found a way to carry it. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had carried the equivalent of a love letter in dead animal form, half a mile through a pre-dawn forest, and left it on the threshold of a man who might have rejected it without even understanding what he was rejecting, and felt something so tender and fierce at once that he did not immediately have words for it. I'm glad I didn't know what leaving it untouched meant, he said, because I wouldn't have known to do anything else. The first thing I thought when I saw it was that someone was looking out for me. Yatul looked at him directly. Someone was, she said. They ate the stew. Outside, the wind drove snow against the cabin walls with a sound like sand on leather. I want to learn the response custom, he said after a while. I've been giving you hospitality because I'm a hospitable person, but I want to do it right. What does it mean in your tradition for a man to formally acknowledge a hunt gift? She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her deciding something. He offers a made gift in return, she said, something he has made with his own hands. It does not have to be impressive. It has to be genuine. He thought about that. He looked at his hands, the baker's hands, the homesteader's hands. He thought about what he made in the truest sense. 3 days later, when she arrived in the late afternoon through 6 inches of new snow, he had a wrapped bundle waiting on the table. A full round loaf of his best bread, the kind he made for the Fernville market, gold-encrusted and fragrant with the dried herbs from his garden. Wrapped in a piece of clean linen he had spent an hour hemming properly at the edges so it would fold clean. Under the bread, on a piece of flat birch bark, he had written her name in the common letters, and beneath it, in the Stoneclan runes, he had spent 3 days practicing from memory of the letters she had shown him in passing, her name again. She stood at the table and looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked up the birch bark and looked at her name in the runes she had grown up writing. This is not right, she said, pointing to the 3rd character. This one curves left, not right. I know, he said. I practiced it 40 times and I kept going right. It's a problem with my wrist. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. You learned the runes, she said. It seemed right, he said, for your name. She set the birch bark down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and stood with her back to him for a moment. And when she turned around, her face was doing something it had never done before in front of him. Not crying she was not, he would learn, a person who cried easily or often, but the closest she came to it, which was a particular opening in the face, a dropping of the careful guard, a rawness that was both more beautiful and more moving than he had been prepared for. Samuel, she said. Yatul, he said. And then, because neither of them were the type to make speeches when something simpler would do, she crossed the space between them, and he stood up from the table to meet her. And she put one of those large, extraordinary hands against his face with a gentleness that was like being touched by something that had never needed to be gentle before and had chosen it anyway. And he put his hand over hers and held it there. They stood like that for a moment, in the fire-lit cabin with the winter pressing against the walls, and it was the beginning of the real thing. The winter was long, as Duskwood winters always were, and they moved through it together in the slow, particular way of two people learning the dimensions of each other. He taught her to bake bread. She was impatient with the waiting that dough required, and the first 3 attempts came out like small boulders, and they both found this unreasonably funny. She taught him to track, spending long cold mornings walking the snowbound forest with him, pointing out the signs he had always been blind to. The deer path worn below the snow line, the scratch marks on the elder oak bark where a wolf had sharpened its claws at exactly shoulder height, the story the forest told for people who could read it. He was a slow student. She was a patient teacher, more patient than he would have expected from a woman whose default mode of problem-solving was direct physical confrontation with large, dangerous animals. He met some of the Stoneclan that winter, briefly and at a distance. Twice, when he was walking the boundary of his property with Yatul, they encountered hunters from the clan who looked at him with expressions ranging from frank assessment to cool wariness and spoke to Yatul in the Stoneclan tongue, quickly and privately, while he stood at a respectful distance and looked at the trees. The conversations were short. Afterward, Yatul would say something minimal like they were asking about the boundaries, and he would nod and let it go, because he understood that this was her world to manage and that his role was not to push. But he noticed that the hunter's expressions over those months shifted, not to warmth, not yet, but to a kind of acknowledgement. He was the bread man of the Duskwood road. He had survived 3 winters. He kept his territory clean, and he was clearly, visibly, whatever he was to Yatul Stonefist, and Yatul Stonefist was not a person whose judgment the Stoneclan took lightly. The difficult conversation came in late winter, when the snow was still heavy but the light had lengthened enough to promise that spring existed somewhere in the world's intentions. Yatul came to the cabin with mud on her boots. The snow had softened enough in the midday hours to turn to slush, and a tightness around her eyes that he had learned to read as something specific, not the tightness of danger or anger. The tightness of unwanted news being carried at arm's length. She sat down at the table and said, without preamble, "My father has sent word through my eldest brother that he wants me to return to the clan seat for the spring gathering. There is a man, a warrior from the northern Stoneclan clan branch, that my father wishes me to meet with formal intent." Samuel was at the hearth. He did not turn around immediately. He took a moment because he was a man who preferred to say the right thing to saying the quick thing. Then he turned around. "What do you want?" he asked. She looked at him with those amber eyes. "You know what I want," she said. "Then say it," he said. "Say it clearly, so I know I'm not misunderstanding." Her jaw worked for a moment. Then, "I brought you a boar killed with my bare hands, Samuel. I have been coming to this cabin through snow for 4 months. I sat in your second chair in the dark and let you learn my name in my own script." She met his eyes. "I want you. I have wanted you since before the boar. The question is not what I want. The question is what this is and what it can be and whether I love you, he said. The words came out without ceremony, which was how he had always suspected they would come, because he was not a ceremonious man. They came out steady and clear, with the simple weight of something that had been true for long enough that saying it was less a revelation than a confirmation. Yatul went very still. She watched him across the cabin. I have read enough of your human books, she said carefully, to know that your people say those words with different weights, some very lightly, some as heavy as stone. Mine are stone, he said. She stood up from the table, and she walked to him, and she stood in front of him with her amber eyes a few inches above his. The height difference was something he had stopped noticing in the ordinary way of things but was very present to him now, because she was enormous and magnificent and looking at him like he was something she had not expected the world to contain. I love you, she said. In the low, precise way she said everything that mattered, like each word was being given its full weight. I did not have a word for it when I brought the boar. I had a decision and a certainty and something that felt very much like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to step off. But the word is accurate now. He reached up and put his hand against her face, the mirror of what she had done to him months ago in this same cabin, and she leaned into it slightly, like an animal accepting something it has wanted to accept for a long time. What are you going to tell your father? He said. The truth, she said. That I have already made my declaration by Stoneclan custom and received an accepted response, and that I am not available for a formal introduction to anyone else. He will not be pleased. Will it cause you problems? Yes, she said without drama, but solvable ones. My father is a difficult man, but he is not an unreasonable one. He will need time. She paused. He will need to meet you. I would like to meet him, Samuel said, and the steadiness in his own voice surprised him slightly because the prospect of meeting the chief of the Stoneclan was objectively frightening. When you're ready for that. She looked at him for a moment. You are not afraid. I'm very afraid, he said, but that doesn't change whether I want to do it. Something in her face went warm and certain, and she bent down, a significant bend, given the height difference, and kissed him for the first time, slow and deliberate, and as full of weight as her words always were. Spring came eventually, as spring always does in the end, breaking through the last of the winter crust with green and mud and birdsong. The world of the Duskwood frontier went from monochrome to every shade of green in the space of 2 weeks, and Samuel's garden put out its first new shoots, and the clay oven got a week of thorough cleaning and resealing, and life expanded again in the way it always did when the cold lifted. Yatul went to the spring gathering. She was gone for 10 days, which was the longest they had been separated since the Boar morning, and he discovered that absence, which had always just been the condition of his frontier life, now had a specific shape and weight and name. He baked. He kept busy. He visited Fernville for the first time in months and traded 3 weeks' worth of bread for new tool stock and a length of good wool cloth that he had been meaning to get. At the Fernville market, 2 human traders who knew of him asked with unconcealed curiosity whether it was true he had been spending the winter with an orc woman out on the Duskwood road, and he said yes flatly, and the curiosity on their faces cycled through various stages before settling, for the most part, on something between uncertain acceptance and determined neutrality, which was about the best he expected from Fernville. He did not ask them what they thought of it. He was not interested in assembling their opinions. Yatul came back on the 11th day, arriving at dusk with her satchel over one shoulder and mud on her boots, and a look on her face that he had learned to read as the aftermath of a large, tiring, multi-stage argument. She sat down in her chair on his porch. She had stopped distinguishing between her chair and any chair a long time ago, which was a kind of domesticity that pleased him unreasonably, and accepted a cup of the berry wine and said, "My father wants to meet you. He is not happy. But he is not refusing." "That's better than refusing," Samuel said. "He is the kind of man who needs to make up his own mind about things," she said. "Once he meets you, He will either find a reason to accept it or a reason to oppose it, and at least then we will know where we stand." She looked at him sidelong. "My sister Maruk says she already likes you, based on what I have told her, and that you cannot possibly be as patient and gentle as I describe, and that she wants to see it for herself." "I'm not particularly patient and gentle," Samuel said. "You are by Stoneclan standards," she said. "You have never once been loud or aggressive in my presence." "I'm not aggressive by nature," he said. "That is unusual," she said, with the particular tone she used for things that were self-evidently true in her experience and perhaps ought not to be. "Most men, when they feel uncertain, become loud. You become still." "Is that better or worse?" he asked. "Better," she said. "Much better." She leaned her head back against the chair, looking at the evening sky. "I told my father that the declaration was made in full custom and accepted." He asked how a human man could have accepted a Stoneclan declaration, and I told him that you accepted the hospitality obligation instinctively, without knowing the form, because that is the kind of man you are. She paused. He was quiet for a long time after that. My father goes quiet when he is thinking seriously about something. What did he say after the quiet? He said bring him to the summer gathering, she said, and we will see. The summer gathering was 6 weeks away. In those 6 weeks, Samuel Barker did something that would be talked about later by both Stoneclan and the human settlers of the Duskwood Road, in the way that small acts of genuine effort get talked about when they happen in places where people are watching for exactly that kind of thing. He learned Stoneclan. Not fluently, 6 weeks was not enough for fluency in a language as structurally different from the common tongue as Stoneclan was, but functional courtesy. Greeting forms. The formal address for an elder. The way to offer respect to a clan chief without the phrasing that in Stoneclan carried the connotation of submission to an enemy rather than respect to an equal. He asked Yatul to teach him every evening, and she did, sometimes with the pained patience of a woman watching a man try to pronounce sounds that simply did not exist in his native tongue, sometimes with a helpless, genuine laughter at his worst attempts that was one of his favorite sounds in the world. He also baked. He prepared, for the summer gathering, 12 full loaves of his best bread, 2 wheels of hard cheese he had been carefully aging since early spring, and a small cask of the same berry wine he had traded for at Fernville, which he had learned from Yatul was a Stoneclan flavor they traded outward, but rarely got back in finished form. He was not going to the Stoneclan gathering as a man with nothing to offer. He was going as a man who made things with his hands and believed in the value of that. The Stoneclan summer gathering was held in the deep forest, 3 hours' walk from the cabin, at a clearing that had been used for this purpose for so long that the grass in its center grew in a perfect circle from generations of fires built in the same place. Samuel arrived with Yatul at his side in the late morning of the gathering's second day. The first day was internal clan business, and the experience of walking into a clearing of approximately 200 orcs as the only human present was something he would not forget for the rest of his life. It was not actively hostile. He had been braced for that, and it did not happen. What he walked into was a careful, thorough, extremely pointed collective attention, the kind that a clan of people who had spent centuries reading strangers for threat assessment applied to a target who was interesting rather than obviously dangerous. Every conversation that had been happening in the clearing, reduced in volume and redirected toward him, quietly and simultaneously, like sunflowers turning in a new direction. He had been told by Yatul the 3 things he must do when entering a gathering as a guest. He did them correctly, in sequence. He acknowledged the clan banner at the clearing's northern edge. He made the appropriate gesture of greeting toward the eldest visible person, and he did not enter beyond the outer ring of the gathering until someone from within invited him forward. He stood at the edge and waited, with his 2 large cloth bags of bread and cheese and his small cask of berry wine, and did not attempt to fill the silence with nervous speech. Yatul Stonefist came to him, which was a gesture that Samuel did not recognize as meaningful, until Yatul told him later that for a clan elder to come to the guest rather than making the guest approach was a signal of genuine inquiry rather than inspection. He was a large man, even by orc standards, with the same amber eyes as his daughter but older and harder, his black hair gone gray at the temples, his face carrying the particular topography of a life lived in serious weather. He looked at Samuel with eyes that missed nothing and said, in the common tongue, with an accent that was not quite the same as Yatul's but recognizable, "You are the baker." "Yes," Samuel said. "My daughter has spoken well of you," Gardock said. This was not warmth, it was information. "She has spoken well of you," Samuel said. "She says you are the kind of man who needs to make his own mind up about things and that once you do, it stays made." Gardock studied him. "She told you this?" "Yes. And you think telling me this is helpful to you?" "I think it is accurate," Samuel said. "And I would rather start an honest conversation with you than a careful one." Gardock was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bags and the cask. "What did you bring?" "Bread," Samuel said. "My best, 12 loaves, 2 wheels of aged cheese, and a cask of Stoneclan berry wine, finished, because I understand you trade the berries out and rarely get the finished product back." He paused. "I wanted to bring something you did not already have, and I make things." Gardock looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in his face, not softening exactly, but opening, the way a fortress opens when it has decided that the person outside is not coming to attack it but might be worth letting look at the walls. He reached out and took the cask, popped the seal with one thumb and smelled the contents. "Sit down, Baker," he said. "Let us talk." They sat together for 2 hours at the edge of the gathering, while the clan moved and ate, and made the 100 small transactions of a gathering around them. Gardock asked him questions with the methodical patience of a man assembling a picture, and Samuel answered them honestly. Why he had come to the frontier, what he intended to make of his life there, how he understood the Stoneclan territory and his relation to it, what he knew of his daughter and how he knew it, what he meant when he said love across the barrier of a custom he had not known existed until it had already been extended to him. He spoke carefully and without performance, and Gardock listened with the same, and at the end of the 2 hours the clan elder did not give his blessing. That was not how it was done. Yatul had told him. A parent gave opinion and counsel, not permission, in Stoneclan tradition, but he said, with the flat certainty of a man revising a prior position, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Samuel asked. "A man who wanted something from her," Gardock said. "Access to Stoneclan territory, the protection of a capable woman, a curiosity." He looked at the trees. "You want her," he said. "The specific person. I can see that it is the specific person." "This is harder to argue with than the other things." "I'm not trying to argue," Samuel said. "I'm trying to be honest with you. What you do with that is your own business." Gardock looked at him with something that, if it was not yet approval, was the closest thing to the foothills of it. "She is stubborn," he said. "She does not hear no well. She has the best tracking instincts in the Stoneclan and the worst temper at being managed. She will drive you insane." "I've noticed most of that," Samuel said. And I'm still here," Samuel said. Gardock made a sound that was either a grunt or a suppressed laugh, and after another moment he stood up and walked back into the gathering, and that was the end of the formal meeting. Yatul materialized at Samuel's elbow moments later, having been at a careful distance throughout, and said quietly, "How did it go?" "Your father told me you have a bad temper," Samuel said. "I have a direct disposition," she said precisely. "He said you drive people insane." "I inspire intensity," she said. "He didn't tell me to leave," Samuel said. She was quiet for a moment, watching her father's back as he moved through the gathering. Something moved in her face, not entirely readable but warm and a little bit like relief. "No," she said. "He did not." The summer following the gathering was the summer they began, seriously and with deliberate attention, to build something. Not just what they were to each other, that was already built, already solid, but the physical, practical shape of a shared life on the Duskwood frontier. Samuel expanded the cabin. He had been meaning to do it since the second winter, adding a second room and a proper covered porch that could be used in the rain, but the motivation had always been abstract before. It was not abstract now. He felled the timber carefully, keeping Yatul's teachings about the forest in mind, taking only from the edge of the natural clearing and leaving the deep-root trees alone, and she helped him with the hauling and the rough shaping. And two of her brothers showed up without announcement on the third day of the build, and worked alongside him for a week with an efficiency and a professional silence that managed to be simultaneously intimidating and hospitable. And by the end of it, there was a second room with a proper window and a covered porch with room for 4 chairs instead of 2. Her brothers left without ceremony. One of them, the younger one, who she called Dusktooth in the Stoneclan tongue, though his formal name was something longer, clapped Samuel on the shoulder on his way out with a force that rocked him back half a step, which Yatul told him later was a gesture of full acceptance, the equivalent of a handshake with formal intent behind it. The older brother said nothing at all but made the eyes-to-eyes gesture of the Stoneclan acknowledgement, which was also, she told him, positive. "Your brothers are terrifying," Samuel told her. "They are fond of you," she said. "That is how they express it. By nearly knocking me over. He was being gentle," she said. They began to keep a larger garden together. Yatul contributed Stoneclan knowledge of the land, which spots held moisture through drought, which grew best in the particular soil of the Duskwood edge, where wild herbs could be transplanted that she had always gathered from the deep forest but had never thought to cultivate. He contributed his knowledge of planted crops, his techniques for soil preparation, his understanding of timing and rotation. The garden that emerged was unlike anything either of them could have made alone. A working mix of cultivated human crops and half-wild Stoneclan herbs and root plants that together covered most of what a winter would demand. He baked bread with the Stoneclan herbs. She ate it with the deliberate, attentive appreciation of someone who has a very good palate and takes food seriously, and told him which herbs improved it and which competed with the grain, and they had long conversations over the table about flavor that were simultaneously entirely domestic and entirely them. There were still difficulties. There were always difficulties. Some came from the human side. The settlers further west on the Duskwood Road were not all as straightforwardly accepting as Samuel's own temperament suggested everyone should be, and when word spread as word always spread in frontier communities, which had so little news that everything traveled fast, there was a period of complicated social weather. A trader named Bowles, who had previously bought Samuel's bread at a small markup and resold it in Fernville, stopped buying. 2 homesteading families who had been on civil terms declined to reciprocate his autumn trade visits. A man named Prescott, who ran a trapline that edged uncomfortably close to Stoneclan territory, and had been asking Samuel for years to put in a word with the orcs he was apparently now neighborly with, came by the cabin to make the ask directly and was told, in terms so plain they could not be misunderstood, that Samuel was not an intermediary, that Prescott's trapline was Prescott's problem to negotiate directly with the Stoneclan, and that he was welcome to leave. Prescott left. He was not friendly about it. Over the following months, he made a number of statements in the Fernville market that reached Samuel second-hand, and Samuel let them be. He had learned, from 3 winters of frontier solitude and a lifetime before that of being an ordinary man in a world that had strong opinions about what ordinary men should want, that you could not spend your time on other people's discomfort with your choices. You could only live your choices, cleanly and honestly, and let the example do what it could. Some difficulties came from the Stoneclan side, which was more nuanced. Yatul Stonefist had not given his blessing, but neither had he given his opposition, and this ambiguity left certain members of the clan free to express their own positions, some of which were pointed. There was a warrior named Vrath Sr., respected, the northern branch man that Yatul had originally intended to introduce to Yatul, who made his feelings known through the particular Stoneclan social mechanism of public challenge, which was not a fight but a formal debate of worth conducted in the clan, gathering tongue, measured, structured, and witnessed. He challenged Yatul's decision on the grounds that a human man was not an appropriate match for a Stoneclan chief's daughter, and that the implications for future generations were difficult. Yatul destroyed him in the debate comprehensively, and Samuel was told about it afterwards by her sister Maruk in the breathless, delighted recounting of someone who had watched a very good performance. The clan had sided with Yatul not because human-orc pairing was universally accepted. It was not yet, but because her argument had been sound, and the Stoneclan respected sound argument, and because what Yatul Stonefist had chosen was, after all, her choice to make. After the debate, Gardock came to the cabin. He came alone in the early morning, and Samuel was at the clay oven when he arrived, turning bread, and the clan elder stood in the doorway of the cabin kitchen and watched him work in silence for a while before saying, "My daughter made a good argument." "She usually does," Samuel said, without turning from the oven. "She said that the strength of a match is not measured by sameness but by what each person brings to the other," Gardock said. "She said you bring her stillness and she brings you fire, and that these things are complementary, not competing." Samuel took the loaves from the oven, set them on the stone shelf to cool. Then he turned around. "She said that," he said. "Among other things," Gardock said. He looked at the loaves. He looked at the carved figure on the shelf above the hearth, the woman in the hunter's crouch, which he clearly recognized. His face was very still. "She has been happy," he said. "Since the first winter, the kind of happy that does not announce itself. It is a different thing in a person you know well." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I recognize it in myself." Gardock was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down at the table, with the ease of a man deciding something, and said, "Will you give me one of those loaves and tell me how you make them? I have been eating your bread at the gatherings for 2 seasons, and I want to know how it is done." Samuel gave him a loaf and a cup of the berry wine, and sat down across from him and told him how bread was made, in detail from the grain to the oven. It was the best conversation he had ever had with a frightening person. By the end of it, Gardock left with a loaf under his arm and had shaken Samuel's hand in the human way, firmly and deliberately, the way a man shakes hands when he means it. Yatul, when he told her, was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "He shook your hand." "Yes," Samuel said. "She sat with this. That is, he has never done that with any of the human settlers who have come to his attention." She looked at Samuel. "What did you talk about?" "Bread," Samuel said. She stared at him. "You talked to my father about bread." "It was his idea," Samuel said. "He asked." Another long silence. "He is testing you," she said slowly, "and also somehow genuinely interested in the bread." "Both of those things can be true," Samuel said. "You are very strange," she said, with a warmth that made it entirely a compliment. Autumn came again, the second autumn of their knowledge of each other, and with it came a conversation that had been building in the edges of things for months, spoken in the way that the most important conversations between two people who trust each other tend to be spoken, not as a dramatic declaration but as a careful, honest accounting. They were sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, the leaves turning gold and copper in the Duskwood, the smell of his harvest herbs drying on their racks coming through the cabin window. Yatul had a piece of tanned hide across her lap that she was cutting into the pattern for a new set of winter wraps, and he had a cup of tea, and they had been sitting in comfortable quiet for an hour when she said, without preliminary, "Where do you want your life to go?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean in the long sense," she said. "In the 10-year sense, in the whole sense." She kept her hands moving on the hide, but she was watching him. "Some people want to leave the frontier eventually, to go back to settled towns. Some people want to go further out. Some people want children and some do not. I want to know what you want." He was quiet for a moment. "I want this," he said, "this specific life. The cabin, the garden, the oven, the forest, the road to Fernville." He looked at her hands on the hide. "I want you in it permanently, in whatever form your custom says is the full form. I want children if you want them." He paused. "I am not going back to the settled towns. There is nothing there for me, Everything I have here I built. I am not going further out because I do not want to leave what is here." He looked at her directly. "And I want your clan to be part of it. I want the Stoneclan to know that the homestead on the Duskwood Eastern Road is connected to them by more than proximity. I want us to be something that makes sense to both our peoples, not just to us." Yatul put down the hide slowly and looked at him with an expression of such direct, clear emotion that it hit him in the chest like a physical thing. "The full form in my custom," she said, "is the house binding. It is done at the winter gathering in the presence of the clan. It is," she stopped, and he could see her choosing words carefully. "It is more than a human wedding in some ways and simpler in others. There are obligations, to the clan, to each other, to the territory." She paused. "My father would need to open the gathering to you, formally. As a potential clan friend, which is what a non-Stoneclan man who binds to a clan member becomes." "Do you think he would?" Samuel asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the trees. "I think," she said slowly, "that a man who asked my father how to make bread and left him with a loaf under his arm has done a significant amount of the work already." Samuel turned to face her fully. "Yatul Stonefist," he said, "I am asking you in whatever form makes sense to your custom and mine together, whether you will make this permanent with me." She looked at him for a long, still moment. The leaves moved in the afternoon wind. Somewhere in the deep forest, a bird called twice and went quiet. "Yes," she said. "Completely and permanently, yes." He moved to her and she moved to him, and they met in the middle. And she held him with those extraordinary arms that could kill a boar barehanded, and chose to be completely gentle. And he pressed his face against her neck and breathed her in leather and pine, and the smoke of 1,000 campfires, and something that was simply and specifically herself. And neither of them said anything else for a long time because everything had been said. The winter gathering that year was the largest in recent memory. This was partly coincidence. A good hunting season and a productive trading quarter brought more of the extended Stoneclan to the central seat, and partly, Samuel suspected, not coincidence at all. The Stoneclan had opinions about this winter's business, and they wanted to be present for the forming of them. Gardock opened the gathering to Samuel as a formal clan friend candidate on the first morning, which was a procedural thing that Samuel had prepared for by learning the 3 formal responses in Stoneclan by heart, practicing them, until Yatul said his pronunciation was acceptable. He gave them correctly in the great outdoor hall of the gathering, which was not a building but a space defined by standing stones and an enormous fire at its center, and received the clan's acknowledgement, which was a sound he felt in his sternum, 300 voices making the Stoneclan affirmation together at once. The house binding itself was on the 3rd day. It was conducted by the clan elder in the traditional form, which he did not fully understand, and Yatul had described to him in broad strokes, and it involved a recitation of each person's lineage and history, a declaration of obligation to the other and to the territory, an exchange of made gifts, and the tying of wrists with a cord woven from Stoneclan red bark fiber that was then cut and kept by each party as a permanent possession. For his maid gift, he gave her the birch bark piece with her name in her own script, the original one, with the flawed 3rd character, because he had kept it since the night he had first tried to write her name, and had never found it in him to throw it away, framed now in a small piece of worked wood he had spent 6 autumn evenings shaping. He gave it to her quietly, before the formal ceremony, in the half-moment of privacy they had at the edge of the gathering while Gardock prepared the space. She held it in her hands and looked at it for a moment. "You kept this," she said. "Always," he said. She looked at him, and then she reached into the inside pocket of her winter coat and produced her maid gift, which she had not told him about. It was small, a carved piece of antler bone, shaped like a round of bread, precise in its detail, smooth from handling. "I made this in the first winter," she said. "In the first month before I told you what the boar meant. I kept it because I did not know what to do with it, and I could not make myself get rid of it." He took it and held it, this small carved piece of his own life that she had made in secret during the months before they had words for what they were. "You made this before we—" "Yes," she said. "I was decided even then." He closed his hand around it. "So was I," he said. "I just did not have the language for it." She leaned down and kissed him, brief and firm and complete, before the gathering began. The ceremony was long and formal and conducted entirely in the Stoneclan tongue, which meant Samuel caught perhaps a third of it, but the third he caught was enough. The weight of the obligations, the seriousness of the promises, the sense of two people being woven into something larger than themselves. When Gartok tied the cord around their wrists and spoke the binding words, Samuel did not look at the clan elder or at the assembled gathering. He looked at Yatul, who was looking at him, and her amber eyes were steady and full, and his. The cord was cut. He kept his half. He put it in the pocket where he kept the carved round of bread. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Samuel had experienced in his quiet frontier life, loud and physical and generous. Full of food and fire and Stoneclan music, played on instruments made of stretched hide and carved bone. And the berry wine flowed from a full barrel that Gartok had apparently prepared. And people who had looked at Samuel with cool assessment all winter long found ways, in the firelight and the noise, to be warm. Her sister Maruk pulled him into a circle dance and laughed at him when he got the steps wrong, and the brother called Dusktooth gave him another shoulder clap that he was ready for this time. And Gartok, at the end of the evening, when the fire had burned down to coals, sat beside him and said nothing, but handed him a cup of the wine, and the two of them watched the coals together for a while, and that was enough. The years that came after were not without difficulty, because life on the frontier never is, and because being two people who were also the ongoing evidence of a peace between two cultures carries its own particular weight. But they were good years, solidly and genuinely good, built on a foundation of mutual understanding and a shared willingness to do the work. Samuel's bread became something larger than itself on the Duskwood road. He had always sold at Fernville, but in the years after the house binding, with Yatul's knowledge of the forest and the Stoneclan trade networks, he began supplying a wider range dried herbs in winter, preserved Stoneclan root pastes that had no human equivalent and were in remarkable demand in the settled towns, and eventually the bread itself, in a version that incorporated Stoneclan grain varieties that grew better in the Duskwood soil than anything he had planted before. The homestead became, by degrees, a small thing of note, a place where you could stop on the road between the settled west and the deep Stoneclan territory and be fed and be welcome, a place where the distinction between what was human-made and what was Stoneclan-made was cheerfully blurred. Bowles, the trader who had stopped buying his bread, came back in the third year with a different face about it. Not apologetic exactly, Bowles was not an apologetic sort of man, but with the practical acknowledgement of a man who has watched the market and noticed that the homestead on the Duskwood road is doing rather well. Samuel sold him bread at the original price, which he found satisfying. Prescott, the trapper, eventually overcame his pride enough to make the direct request of the Stoneclan about his trapline, which Yatul helped facilitate because she was a fair-minded person who thought peace was better than its absence, even when the people requiring peace were irritating. The matter was resolved with a formal boundary agreement that Prescott found restrictive but acceptable, and he became, if not friendly towards Samuel and Yatul, at least not hostile, which in frontier terms was a meaningful category of relationship. In the spring of the fourth year, Yatul told him she was pregnant, matter-of-factly, across the breakfast table, the same way she told him anything that was enormous but did not require performance. He sat very still for a moment, and then he stood up and came around the table and held her, and she put her arms around him, and they stayed like that for a long time in the morning light. The child was born in the autumn, after a labor that Yatul endured with a stoicism that Samuel found both admirable and deeply frightening, attended by her sister Maruk, who was formidably competent and entirely calm, and by a midwife from Fernville named Betha, who had delivered half-orc children before and came highly recommended and was as good as her reputation. The child arrived in the world in the early morning, and the first sound of his cry went through the cabin walls and out into the Duskwood dawn like something that the forest had been waiting for. He was a son. He had his mother's amber eyes and his father's brown hair, and his skin was a warm, golden-tinted green that was neither one person's color nor the other's, but something entirely its own. He had a small suggestion of tusks at his lower jaw that Maruk said would develop properly as he grew, and large hands that would never be small. He was, by any measure, perfect. They named him Gar, a name that worked in both the common tongue and the Stoneclan language, which had been Samuel's quiet project for months. Yatul Stonefist, informed by messenger, arrived at the cabin 3 days after the birth, alone again, as was apparently his way for things that mattered. He looked at the child for a long time, held in Yatul's arms at the table, and his face did the same thing it had done when he saw the carved figure on the shelf, the thing that was not quite emotion in the ordinary surface sense but was something deeper and more deliberate. He put one large finger against the baby's fist, and the baby's hand closed around it with the total conviction of newborns. "Gar," Gartok said. "Yes," Samuel said. "Good name," Gartok said. Then, "He has good hands." "He has enormous hands," Yatul said. "He will be large." "He will be strong," Gartok said with satisfaction, and sat down at the table and accepted a cup of tea, and stayed for 2 hours and talked about the clan news and the hunting season, and whether the winter would come early, which was a kind of normalcy so complete, and so earned that Samuel had to look at the wall for a moment to collect himself. Gar grew, as children do, with a speed that was simultaneously obvious and astonishing. He walked at 10 months, which Maruk said was early even by Stoneclan standards. He spoke first in a mixture of both languages, which his parents found delightful and which confused everyone else, and sorted them out by the time he was 3 into 2 clean languages with appropriate context for each. He had his mother's tracking instincts. From the time he could walk, he was observing the ground around the cabin with the same quiet attention that Yatul brought to the forest floor, and his father's patience and his father's hands. By the time he was 4, he was helping Samuel with the bread, sternly serious about the shaping step, which he had decided was the most important part. A daughter came 3 years after Gar, named Sura, which was a Stoneclan name for the first rains of spring. She had Samuel's green eyes in a broader, stronger face, and she was never, from her first hour, a quiet person. She arrived in the world already apparently in the middle of a conversation, and continued it for the rest of her childhood. She was fascinated by trade and by the movements of people on the Duskwood road, and by the time she was 5, she was conducting fierce evaluations of the travelers who stopped at the homestead, asking them where they were going and why in both languages, and comparing their answers to her existing geographic knowledge. Both children moved between the world of the cabin and the world of the Stoneclan gathering with the ease of people who have always had 2 homes and never thought of this as a problem. They went to the winter gathering each year and came back speaking more Stoneclan words than they had left with, because the clan's children taught them, because they were Yatul Stonefist's grandchildren, because they belonged there as fully as they belonged on the homestead. They went to Fernville Market in the wagon with Samuel and came back knowing the names of 3 more traders and having strong opinions about which cheese stall was best. The homestead itself changed with the years. A 3rd room was added when Sura arrived. A proper covered storage building went up in the 8th year, big enough for the full winter's preserved food and the trading stock, and Yatul designed its framing with Stoneclan joinery techniques that gave it a strength that impressed every human builder who saw it. The garden had grown to something that was half orchard, because they had planted fruit trees in the 5th year and the Duskwood soil had taken to them extremely well, and the clay oven had been replaced twice. improved each time. The road between the homestead and Fernville, which Samuel had always thought of as the road to civilization, he began to think of differently as the road in both directions, the road that connected two worlds that were not as separate as they had always been told. More human travelers knew the homestead now. More Stoneclan passed through it, trading and stopping for bread, and the presence of orc figures at the homestead's table was a thing that the human travelers who stopped learned to accept and then, most of them, to appreciate. Because the Stoneclan who stopped here were generally interesting people with good opinions about weather and game and the politics of the Eastern Territories, and interesting company had always been in short supply on the frontier. There were still, occasionally, people who were unkind. This was the world. Samuel had learned not to seek their approval and not to let their disapproval change anything important, and Yatul had always known this, because she had grown up as the clan chief's daughter who kept going to the human market and talking to human traders and reading their books, and the cost of that kind of stubborn cross-border curiosity was a certain amount of social weather that you learned to let pass. In the 10th year of their house binding, there was a bad winter worse than any Samuel had seen on the frontier, the kind of cold that broke tools and froze streams solid and made the road to Fernville impassable for 3 weeks. Several of the more isolated homesteads to the west ran short of food, and Samuel and Yatul spent 2 weeks making deliveries. He in the wagon on the road when it opened, she through the forest on the clan paths that the snow never fully closed, carrying bread and dried goods to the homesteads that needed them. It was a matter of course for both of them, not heroism, just the simple accounting of who had enough and who did not and what could be done about it. The families they helped did not all become friends, but some of them did, and the others remembered, which matters in a frontier community where memory is long and credit is kept. Yatul Stonefist died in the 12th year in the early spring, which was the way he had apparently chosen to go, in his bed at the clan seat, with his family around him, in the particular season when the world was returning to itself, and he had always said he liked best. He had been slowing for 2 years, though not in any way that announced itself dramatically, the slowness of a man approaching 70 who had lived hard and was simply, gradually, stopping. He asked for Samuel at the end, which Samuel learned via urgent message from Yatul's brother Duskwood, and reached the clan seat in 4 hours on horseback, arriving barely in time. He sat beside the old man in the last hour and did not say much, because Yatul had never been a man for many words and held his hand, which Yatul allowed without comment. In the last minutes Yatul said, not looking at him, "You made her happy." "She made me happy," Samuel said. "Yes," Yatul said, "that is the correct way to do it," and then he was quiet and did not speak again. Yatul grieved her father with the Stoneclan form silent and inward for 3 days, visible and communal at the gathering that followed, a fierce and formal sorrow that was also, clearly, respect. Samuel stayed beside her through all of it, where she wanted him, which was close, and did not try to translate her grief into anything other than what it was. He understood that the man who had sat across his table and asked how bread was made had become, across 12 years and many small transactions of honesty, something meaningful to him too. Not a father exactly, but something with that weight in it. Life settled after the grief, as it does. The Stoneclan chose a new elder, not Yatul's brother, as some had expected, but her cousin, a careful woman named Shada who had Yatul's same quality of going quiet before speaking, and who had always been cordial to Samuel and warm to Yatul, and was considered by the clan to be a healing choice after the long complications of the previous generation's politics. Under Shada, the formal relationship between the Stoneclan and the homestead on the Duskwood Road was codified for the first time into something like a treaty, not a grand political document, but a practical written agreement about territory, trade routes, and mutual aid that was witnessed and signed by the Fernville Town Council and the Stoneclan gathering both, and that made the homestead specifically a point of connection between the two. a liminal place that belonged fully to neither and was useful to both. Samuel's name was on the document, so was Yatul's. The children's names were on it as the homestead's declared inheritors, which made the whole thing somewhat larger than either of them had intended when they started talking about the garden. Gar, at 14, read the document twice and then said, with his mother's directness and his father's precision, "This says the homestead is responsible for maintaining the road between Fernville and the clan boundary in passable condition." He looked at his parents. "That is a lot of road." "It is," Samuel agreed. "We will need more people," Gar said. "Eventually." "Eventually," Samuel agreed. "I'm going to need to learn how roads are maintained," Gar said, and went to find a book about it, which was so precisely his father's approach to a problem that Samuel had to sit down with the emotion of it. Sura, at 11, read the document and immediately asked about the trade route implications and whether the homestead was going to be receiving more traffic, and what that meant for the bread supply, and could they grow more grain if they cleared the North Meadow. And Samuel said possibly. And Sura said she was going to ask Grandmother Maruk about the North Meadow soil because Grandmother Maruk knew every piece of land in the Duskwood Valley. The 15th year of the house binding arrived on a winter morning that Samuel noticed in the particular way he had always noticed the changing of seasons. Not with announcement but with presence, standing on the porch in the early light with his chicory brew, watching the frost on the porch rail, listening to the forest breathe. Yatul came out behind him, wrapped in the heavy wool blanket she had gradually taken full possession of over 15 winters, and stood beside him, and they watched the frost and the light together in the silence that two people build across 15 years. Not the silence of nothing to say, but the silence of everything already understood. She put her arm around him. She had to angle it down to get it across his shoulders, which she had always done without thinking about it, which he had always loved. "What are you thinking?" she asked, in the quiet way she asked it, the way that meant she was not requiring an answer, just wondering. "I'm thinking about the boar," he said. She made a sound that was a laugh, low and complete. "You think about the boar a great deal for a man who was not even sure what it meant." "I think about it because it was the beginning," he said, "the very beginning of everything." She was quiet for a moment. "I was terrified," she said, "standing at the tree line watching you look at it. I had been watching your smoke from the cabin for 2 seasons, thinking about how to say the thing I wanted to say. The boar was the decision made physical, but then I had to stand there and wait for you to find it, and I did not know. You didn't know I'd invite you in," he said. "I did not know anything," she said, "except that I had decided, and the deciding was done, and whatever happened next had to be faced." He reached up and put his hand over hers on his shoulder and held it there. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me. I have thought about it many times what would have happened if I had known the custom before that morning. If I had understood what the boar meant when I found it, I would still have invited you in. I want to be completely clear about that." He looked at the frost on the rail. "But I am glad I didn't know in a strange way. Because the way it went, I invited you in just because it seemed right. Just because you had done something generous and strange and I wanted to know the person who had done it, before I knew anything else about what it meant." He looked at her. "I got to choose you without any weight of custom on it. Just the choosing." Yatul looked at him for a long moment, the amber of her eyes in the early light, the years in them, the life. "You know," she said slowly, "I chose you the same way. The custom was the form, but the choosing was mine. I had watched you for 2 seasons, Samuel. I watched you talk to the deer at the edge of your garden like they were a nuisance you could negotiate with. I watched you fix your fence post 3 times in one day rather than leave it crooked. I watched you sit on this porch in the evening and simply be present in the world, not fighting it." She paused. "I chose you the way you choose something that was always right, and that you are finally being honest about." He turned to face her fully, and she was already looking at him, and he reached up and put his hand against her face, the way he had done that first winter in the fire-lit cabin, and she leaned into it with the same particular ease, the same deliberate choice of gentleness from a person who had never needed to be gentle but had decided to be with him always. "I would choose you again," he said, "every morning, without knowing the custom. I would find the boar on the porch and I would pick it up and say, 'Yes, whoever did this is someone I want to know.'" She covered his hand with hers, both of them pressed against her face in the winter morning, and she said, "Then we understand each other entirely." Inside the cabin, they could hear the children Gar's low early morning voice and Sura's higher one, already in full conversation about something, already making the day. The smell of the banked fire's warmth came through the door. Beyond the porch, the Duskwood stretched its enormous, ancient, indifferent to everything patience in every direction. The trees that had been here before any of them and would be here after. And at the edge of where the forest began, a pair of deer were moving through the early light, unhurried, the frost white on their backs. Samuel Barker stood on his porch in the 15th winter of his house binding, with his wife's arm across his shoulders and the day beginning around him, and felt, with the complete, clear-eyed certainty that does not need to announce itself because it has been true long enough to simply be the foundation of things, that this was the life he had been trying to find when he had come out to the edge of the world with his tools and his seeds, and his stubborn refusal to settle for less than something real. He had not found it the way he had expected. He had found it on a frostbitten morning with a dead boar on his threshold, left by a woman he had not yet met who had already decided he was worth the risk of the full, bare-handed declaration. He had not known what the boar meant. He had known what to do with it anyway. Welcome it, and by welcoming it, welcome everything that came after. They stood together until the light had fully arrived and the frost had gone from the rail, and then Yatul said, in the practical tone she used for things that were practical, "Gar will burn the porridge if we leave him with it too long," and Samuel said, "He does that every time," and she said, "He does not respect the heat," and Samuel said, "He gets that from me." And she made the low laugh that was his favorite sound in any language, and they went inside. The door closed behind them on the winter morning. The Duskwood breathed around the cabin. The deer at the tree line lifted their heads at the sound of voices inside, children and laughter, and the smell of bread already being started, and then lowered them again and walked on into the forest, unhurried, at home in the world. The carved wooden figure of the woman in the hunter's crouch stood on the shelf above the hearth, as it had for 15 years. The birchbark piece with the name in the Stoneclan script, the third character still curving the wrong way, preserved forever in its small wooden frame hung on the wall beside the window. The half of the house-binding cord was in the small carved box on Samuel's side of the bed, next to the carved antler-bone round of bread that Yatul had made in the first winter, before there were words for what she was deciding. The things you keep are the true record. Not the formal documents, not the agreements witnessed and signed, not even the ceremonies conducted in the right language with the right words. Though these matter, they matter enormously. They are the structure that holds the living thing, but the small kept objects, worn smooth with handling, that tell the story of two people who found each other at the edge of a wilderness and decided, without knowing all the rules, without having any guarantees, that the other person was worth every single thing it would take to build a life together. A dead boar on a threshold in the early frost, an invitation to come in out of the cold. A second chair that had been waiting, for no reason anyone could explain, for exactly as long as it needed to. This is how it begins, and this is how it goes, and this is how it endures, not in the grand gestures but in the daily choosing, the morning coffee in the winter light, the hand against the face, the door that opens from inside before you have finished knocking, in the bread made with someone else's herbs, in the name learned in someone else's script, imperfect and genuine and kept, in the weight of a decision made bare-handed, set down at someone's threshold and accepted without hesitation, in the life that grows from the yes.